You didn't fall apart. You went quiet. And somehow, that silence made someone believe you were weaker than you really are. If you're a Libra, you know this moment. The moment you stop explaining yourself. The moment you're too tired to defend your heart. Not because you lost your strength, but because you were conserving it. I'm not here to tell you what they did. I'm here as a friend, to talk about the exact second when someone misread your pause. And everything quietly shifted. Because when you step back to rebalance yourself, some people don't see wisdom. They see an opening. Take a breath with me for a second. If this already feels personal, leave a comment and say, "I trust myself now." And ask yourself this: what if your lowest point wasn't the end of your power, but the moment others revealed how little they truly understood you? Stay with me. This isn't a warning. It's the beginning of a much bigger realization. You stayed with me a moment ago. That breath you took wasn't accidental. It was your body recognizing something your mind hadn't named yet. Because here's the part most people miss about that lowest point. You weren't breaking. You were pausing. I want you to hear this the way a friend would say it, sitting across from you late at night, voice low, no rush. When you stopped explaining yourself, it wasn't because you had nothing left to say. It was because you finally realized how expensive explaining had become. You were tired in a very specific way. Not dramatic tired. Not hopeless tired. The kind of tired that comes after years of weighing every word, smoothing every edge, trying to keep the peace even when it cost you pieces of yourself. Libra energy does that. You don't walk away loudly, you step back quietly, you reassess, you recalibrate. And that pause, it looked empty from the outside. But inside, it was full of math, emotional math, what still feels fair, what no longer does. Here's something I learned the hard way. Silence is often mistaken for surrender by people who have never learned restraint. They think if you're not reacting, you're not aware. If you're not defending yourself, you must be confused. If you're not pushing back, you must be losing ground. But you weren't losing ground. You were reclaiming it. There's a moment, right there in the pause, when you stop performing balance for others and start restoring it for yourself. It doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels hollow, like standing in a room after the furniture's been moved out. And that's usually when doubt whispers. Should I say something? Should I correct them? Should I prove who I really am? Let me ask you something gently. What if not proving it was the first honest choice you'd made in a long time? Because when you stopped trying to be understood, something subtle happened. You began to understand yourself more clearly. Your limits came into focus. Your tolerance line shifted, and the weight you'd been carrying that wasn't yours started to fall away. This is the part no one claps for. There's no applause in a pause, no validation, just quiet and trust. Trust that stepping back doesn't erase you. Trust that resting your voice doesn't weaken your truth. Trust that balance can be rebuilt without an argument. If you're listening and this feels uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone in it. And you don't need to rush out of this space. This pause wasn't a mistake, it was a signal. So before we go any further, let me ask you something softly. What did you stop doing when you went quiet? And what did that silence finally give you permission to feel? Stay right here with me. Because once you understand what that pause really meant, you'll start to see why someone else misread it so badly. And why that misunderstanding quietly set a new balance into motion. You stayed quiet, and that quiet didn't land the way you thought it would. I've watched this pattern unfold more times than I can count. Not as a spectator, as someone who's lived it. When you stop reacting, when you stop correcting the narrative, when you stop adjusting your tone to keep things smooth, some people don't slow down with you. They speed up, They start filling in the silence with their own assumptions. That's the part no one warns you about. Silence doesn't always calm the room. Sometimes it unsettles it. For a Libra, silence is usually intentional. It's not confusion, it's discernment. It's that moment where you're weighing more than words. You're weighing energy, motives, patterns you've seen before but didn't want to name. But people who live in reaction don't read silence that way. They read it through urgency, through impatience, through their own fear of losing control. So they start telling themselves stories. They assume you didn't notice. They assume you're distracted. They assume you've lost your footing. And here's the quiet truth. They aren't studying you. They're projecting themselves. If they went silent, it would mean they were overwhelmed. If they stepped back, it would mean they were losing ground. So they assume the same must be true for you. But Libra silence isn't collapse. It's calibration. I want you to really sit with this for a moment. When you pulled your energy back, you weren't disengaging from life. You were disengaging from noise, from emotional static, from conversations that kept circling without ever landing anywhere honest. And that's when things get interesting. Because when you stop feeding a dynamic, it exposes who was relying on your reactions to stay balanced. Your calm removes their reference point. Your stillness takes away their leverage. So they rush. They speak too soon. They overstep. They reveal intentions that would have stayed hidden if you'd kept smoothing things over. This isn't punishment, it's physics. People who mistake silence for weakness often move recklessly. They assume there's no consequence because there's no immediate response. But what they don't realize is that you're not absent. You're watching. Not with judgment, with clarity. There's a strange kind of power in that. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. Let me ask you something gently. When you stopped reacting, who suddenly felt uncomfortable around you? And what did that discomfort reveal that words never did? Because that's where the real shift begins. Not when someone underestimates you out loud, but when their behavior changes because they no longer know how to read you. Stay with me here. We're moving into a deeper layer now. One where the silence you chose starts to reflect something back to you. Something about how others have been seeing you all along. You're still here. That tells me something. Because once you notice how people react to your silence, the next realization can feel uncomfortable. Not heavy, just clarifying. Let me say this to you the way a friend would, without anger, without blame. They didn't really look at you. They looked at themselves and assumed you were the same. I've learned this slowly over time. Most people don't actually study another person's inner world. They don't pause long enough. They don't listen deeply enough. They measure others by their own limits. So when you went quiet, they didn't ask why. They filled the space with familiar logic. Their logic. If they pulled back, it would mean fear. If they stopped responding, it would mean confusion. If they softened, it would mean weakness. So they assumed that must be true for you too. But Libra, your pause wasn't born from fear. It came from awareness, from noticing patterns repeat, from realizing balance was being maintained, at your expense. There's something subtle here that deserves attention. Projection isn't cruel, it's incomplete. People project when they don't have the capacity to imagine a different internal process than their own. They aren't plotting, they aren't conspiring. They're translating your behavior through the only emotional language they know. And that's why it felt so strange. Because they weren't responding to who you are. They were responding to who they would be in your place. You see this clearly when expectations suddenly shift. When someone treats you as if you're less steady than before. As if you need direction. as if you've lost perspective. That moment can sting, not because you believe it, but because you realize how little they truly understood you all along. And that realization carries a quiet grief, not dramatic grief, the kind that arrives gently, the understanding that some people were connected to your role, not your essence. But here's where something important happens. When projection replaces understanding, truth has room to breathe. You stop needing to correct the image, because correcting it would only deepen the misunderstanding. You let it sit. You let it speak for itself. And in that stillness, something rebalances inside you. You begin to see the difference between being seen and being assumed, between being valued and being useful. That distinction changes how you move, how you speak, how much access you give to your inner world. Let me ask you something softly, just between us. Who started treating you differently once you stopped explaining yourself? And what did that quietly reveal about the connection? This isn't about disappointment. It's about discernment. Because when you understand that their misjudgment came from limitation, not malice, you stop carrying the weight of it. You don't need to fight it. You don't need to defend against it. You simply step into clearer ground. And as you do, something else begins to take shape. Not a reaction, not a correction, a shift in position. Stay with me here, because once you see how projection works, you'll start to notice the exact moment when you chose not to push back, and instead, quietly changed where you stand. You didn't announce it when it happened. There was no dramatic moment, no final conversation, no door slammed shut. The shift began quietly. Right at the moment you stopped explaining yourself. I want to slow this down with you, because this part matters more than it seems. For a Libra, explaining is almost second nature. You explain to keep things fair. You explain to keep the peace. You explain so no one feels misunderstood or left behind. So when you stopped, it wasn't impulsive. It was intentional. You realized something subtle but powerful. Every explanation was keeping a dynamic alive that no longer deserved your energy. Every clarification was inviting someone back into a space they hadn't handled with care. And so you chose something different. You didn't argue. You didn't defend. You didn't rush to correct the story. You observed. That choice alone began to move the balance. Because when you stop explaining, people are left alone with their own behavior. There's no mirror held up for them anymore. No soft landing, no translation. And that's when things reveal themselves. I've seen this over and over in my own life. The moment you stop smoothing the edges, the truth sharpens on its own. Words become unnecessary. Patterns start speaking louder than any conversation ever could. This is where Libra wisdom lives, not in confrontation, in calibration. You watched who respected the boundary without being told. You noticed who grew uneasy without access to your reasoning. You felt who stayed steady even when you stopped compensating. None of this required force. It required restraint. And restraint is not weakness, it's maturity. There's a kind of balance that only shows up when you remove yourself from the equation. When you let others carry their own reactions. When you stop managing outcomes that were never yours to control. That's when the scale begins to level itself. Not all at once, not dramatically, but unmistakably. You might have felt it as a quiet relief at first. Less tension in your chest, more space in your thoughts, a sense that you were no longer negotiating your worth. And maybe there was discomfort too. Because when you stop explaining, you also stop being misunderstood in familiar ways. You stop playing a role that once felt necessary. Let me ask you something gently. When you stopped explaining, What did you finally allow yourself to notice about the situation that words had been distracting you from? This is where your power shifted. Not outward. Inward. You didn't need to convince anyone. You didn't need agreement. You simply needed alignment with yourself. And that alignment changed the atmosphere. Some people adjusted naturally. Others didn't know how to stand without leaning on your explanations. Both responses gave you information. Valuable information. Because balance doesn't come from big gestures. It comes from small, consistent decisions to stay honest with yourself. And once that honesty takes root, something else becomes clear. You don't have to push back to change a dynamic. Sometimes, the most powerful move is choosing where you stand. Stay here with me. Because what comes next isn't about reaction or resistance. It's about what happened the moment you shifted your position, and how that quiet choice changed the entire field around you. This is the part where people usually misunderstand you. And honestly, I don't blame them. Because from the outside, it looks like you did nothing. No reaction, no counter move, no final stand. But I know better. And if you're listening right now, you do too. You didn't push back. You repositioned. There's a quiet intelligence in that choice that rarely gets acknowledged. Most people only recognize power when it's loud, when it argues, when it proves, when it wins in plain sight. But Libra power doesn't announce itself like that. I've watched you do this before. When a situation starts to feel off balance, you don't immediately resist it. You shift your weight. You take one step to the side. You stop standing where the pressure expects you to be. And suddenly, the whole dynamic feels different. This is where people get it wrong about you. They assume silence means surrender. They assume calm means compliance. They assume you stayed because you didn't know how to leave. But what they didn't see was the internal movement, the quiet decision, the moment you realized that staying in the same position was costing you more than changing it ever could. So you moved. Not dramatically, not angrily, just enough. And when you did, something subtle happened. The balance they were standing on shifted too. People who thought they had leverage suddenly felt unsteady. People who assumed they were above the situation began to feel out of sync. Not because you pushed them down, but because you were no longer holding the structure in place. That's the thing about repositioning. It doesn't attack, it reveals. When you stop absorbing pressure, it has to go somewhere else. When you stop compensating, gaps become visible. When you step out of a role, others have to face how much they relied on you staying there. And none of that requires confrontation. There's a maturity in choosing position over power, in choosing clarity over control, in understanding that you don't have to win an argument to change the outcome. You just have to stop standing where you're being mismeasured. I want you to notice how this felt in your body. Not triumphant, not aggressive, more like relief. Like your shoulders finally dropped. Like you weren't bracing for impact anymore. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Let me ask you something softly. When you stepped back, instead of pushing back, who suddenly had to adjust themselves without your help? Because that moment tells you everything you need to know. Repositioning doesn't make noise, but it changes gravity. And once gravity shifts, nothing can stand the same way again. Some people adapt, some lose their footing. Neither outcome is yours to manage. Your only responsibility was to stand somewhere truer. Stay with me. Because after you reposition, something else begins to take shape quietly inside you. Not a reaction, not a defense, a new standard. And that standard will explain why what changed next had nothing to do with them at all. Something settled after that shift. Not outside of you. Inside. And this is where the story gets quieter, but far more important. Because what changed next wasn't them, it was you. I know that can be uncomfortable to hear at first, not because it's wrong, but because it means the power was always closer than you realized. When you repositioned, you didn't suddenly need explanations anymore. You didn't wait for apologies. You didn't scan the room for validation. You raised your standard. Quietly. Internally. Without announcement. And that's a very Libra kind of evolution. At this stage of life, especially after 35, something shifts in how you relate to tolerance. You stop asking whether something can be endured. You start asking whether it deserves to be. That's a different question, a heavier one, but also a freeing one. You didn't become cold. You became clear. You noticed how certain conversations always left you tired, how certain dynamics required you to bend just a little too far, how peace often came at the cost of your own steadiness. So you adjusted the threshold, not out of bitterness, out of self-respect. And here's the part people rarely talk about. Raising your standard doesn't look dramatic. It looks like silence where arguments used to be, distance where explanations used to live, stillness where you once rushed to smooth things over. You didn't demand better treatment. You stopped participating in what no longer felt balanced. That alone changed everything. Because standards don't negotiate, they don't argue, they simply exist. And once yours shifted, certain behaviors no longer had a place to land. Certain expectations dissolved on their own. Certain people felt the change without being told. Not because you punished them, but because you no longer met them where you used to. There's a deep maturity in that. One that doesn't seek closure through conversation. One that finds it through alignment. You didn't need anyone to admit wrongdoing. You didn't need acknowledgement to move forward. You trusted your internal compass enough to let that be sufficient. That's not avoidance. That's wisdom earned through experience. Let me ask you something gently. What did you stop tolerating that you once believed was just part of keeping the peace? That answer matters, because it marks the line between who you were and who you are now. This is where life begins to feel different. Not louder, not easier, but more honest. Your energy becomes selective. Your time becomes intentional. Your presence becomes something you offer, not something others assume. And the beauty of it is this. You don't need to defend that choice. You don't need to justify your standard. You live it. As you do, you may notice something subtle happening around you. Some people adapt, some drift, some grow uncertain in ways they can't quite explain. That's not your concern. What matters is that you're no longer negotiating your worth in spaces that can't meet it. Stay with me here. Because once your standard changes, the world responds in quiet ways. Not all at once, not loudly, but you'll feel it. And that feeling will guide us into the next layer of this story. The moment others sensed the shift before they fully understood it. You may have noticed it before anyone said a word. A slight hesitation. A pause where there used to be confidence. A look that lingered a second longer than necessary. That's usually how it begins. Not with confrontation. Not with consequences announced out loud. Just a quiet sense that something in the room has changed. Because when your standard shifted, the atmosphere did too. And some people felt it immediately, long before they understood why. I've seen this happen in ways that are almost invisible. A message that never gets sent. A joke that lands flat. A request that suddenly feels risky to make. No punishment, no karma playing judge. Just awareness settling into the space. When balance returns, it doesn't favor anyone. It simply stops compensating. And that can feel unsettling to those who were comfortable leaning on you. Not because you did something wrong, but because the center moved back to where it belonged. You didn't announce a boundary. You didn't explain the shift. You didn't correct their behavior. You let the silence do what words never could. And here's the part that takes maturity to recognize. That discomfort you sensed around you was not guilt. It was adjustment. People were recalibrating in real time, trying to understand how to relate to you now that the old reference points were gone, trying to find footing in a dynamic that no longer tilted in their favor. Some adapted gracefully. Others felt off balance in ways they couldn't articulate. Neither response required your involvement. That's an important distinction. You didn't cause their confusion. You simply stopped managing it. And in that stillness, something deeply human revealed itself. Many people don't realize how much they rely on others to hold things together for them, until that support quietly steps away. This isn't blame, it's clarity. When you reclaimed your center, you didn't take anything from anyone. You returned something to yourself. And not everyone knows how to relate to that version of you yet. You might have felt it as distance, or awkwardness, or a subtle cooling where warmth once flowed easily. That doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means the dynamic is finding a new equilibrium. Let me ask you something gently. Who seemed unsure around you after you stopped overextending? And what did that tell you about the role you used to play? Because roles become visible when they're no longer performed. This is where Libra wisdom deepens. You don't rush to fix the imbalance. You allow it to show you what's real. You let others sit with their reactions. You let relationships reveal whether they can stand on mutual ground. You resist the urge to smooth things over just to restore comfort. That restraint is not coldness, it's respect for truth. And here's the quiet gift hidden in all of this. When balance returns, those who meet you there do so willingly, not out of habit, not out of convenience, but out of alignment. That takes time, and patience, and trust in your own center. So if things feel slightly unfamiliar right now, that's okay. You're not losing connection. You're refining it. Stay with this moment a little longer. Because once you accept that not everyone benefits from balance, you begin to understand something even deeper. This shift wasn't about repair. It was about definition. And what comes next isn't a reaction to others at all. It's the quiet realization that you're not returning to who you were. You're standing at a new baseline. There's a quiet relief that comes with realizing this isn't a comeback, because a comeback implies you were knocked down, that you fell behind, that you need to return to something you once were. And that's not your story. What you're feeling now is different. Calmer, more grounded, less urgent. You're not rebuilding anything that was broken. You're recalibrating what was carrying too much weight. I want to say this to you the way a close friend would, without drama. You're not trying to get back to your old self because that version of you lived with compromises you no longer accept. The old balance required effort, constant adjustment, endless consideration for everyone else's comfort. This new baseline feels quieter because it's honest. It's the version of you that knows where your energy belongs, where it doesn't, what you're willing to engage with, and what you no longer need to explain away. For a Libra, this shift can feel almost unfamiliar. You've spent so much of your life refining harmony between people that it's easy to forget harmony begins inside you first. And now, it finally does. You may notice how you enter conversations differently, less prepared to negotiate your needs, more willing to listen to your body when something feels off, more comfortable leaving space where clarity hasn't arrived yet. That's not distance, that's discernment. Your boundaries don't come with speeches anymore. They come with consistency. with the way you show up, with the way you don't. And this is where the real healing lives, not in proving how much you've grown, but in noticing how little you feel the need to explain yourself now. You might even grieve the old version of you for a moment, the one who tried harder, the one who gave more, the one who believed balance meant everyone else felt comfortable. That grief is natural. It doesn't mean you want to go back. It means you honor who you were, but you don't live there anymore. This baseline you're standing on now is built from lived experience, from moments of quiet clarity, from pauses that taught you what mattered, from standards you didn't announce but chose to live by. And the beautiful thing is this: you don't have to defend it, you don't have to justify it, you don't have to rush anyone else to understand it. Those who meet you here will feel it. Those who don't won't be able to stay long. That's not loss, that's alignment. Let me ask you one last thing, gently. As you imagine stepping forward from this place, what feels lighter already? Because that lightness is your compass now. You're not returning to an old chapter. You're standing at the opening of a new one, written with clearer lines, stronger margins, and far more space to breathe. Stay with that feeling. There's more ahead. Not louder, not bigger, just truer. And when you're ready, we'll continue from here. Before we close this circle, let's slow the room down one last time. Notice how different the air feels now. Not louder, not heavier, just clearer. Here's the quiet observation I want to leave you with. The moment you stopped trying to restore balance for everyone else, balance didn't disappear. It relocated. It came home to you. So let me ask you something gently, without urgency. What part of your life feels steadier tonight? Simply because you decided not to overcorrect it anymore? If you can, sit with that question in silence for a few breaths. No answers yet, just awareness. Here's a small inner exercise you can take with you. Over the next day or two, notice where you pause instead of explaining, where you choose stillness instead of repair, where you let something remain unresolved without feeling guilty. That's not avoidance. That's discernment learning to trust itself. I want to say this quietly, as a friend. You don't need to announce your growth. You don't need permission to keep your center. And you don't need to return to a version of yourself that worked harder than it needed to. If this message found you at the right moment, leave a comment and simply write, "I trust my balance now." It helps anchor this space for you and for other Libras walking the same path. And if you feel called, subscribe and stay close. Not because you need more answers, but because sometimes the next message arrives as confirmation, not instruction. I'll leave you with this thought. The strongest Libra energy isn't found in choosing sides. It's found in choosing yourself without making anyone else the enemy. Rest in that tonight. Let the scales settle where they may. We'll continue from here. The journey isn't over. The next message is already forming.